Lori. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to be showing you a watercolor technique that doesn't use water. We're going to be using the Sending Smiles stamping duo, or stamping set. You don't have to have the die cuts for the particular one I'm going to show you, but they are really nice. We're going to use a solid colored stamp. It's a little bit unusual. And most people don't like these because they are solid color. So we're going to start with watercolor paper, and then I'm going to show you my first tip of the day. I am using a vinyl eraser to clean off this rubber stamp. Now this one has been used before, but it doesn't matter. You still need to use the eraser. Now what I'm doing is I'm flicking some ink onto this. You notice very light motion. I'm just barely getting ink on it. You do not want to get this soaked in ink. Now I'm going in and I'm making the lines on the flowers. I'm making echinacea flowers today, which if you are familiar with them, they're sort of pinky purple color, and they're very dark around the center portion with the sort of the lines going out to the edges of the petals. Now what I just did right there is I did not clean my stamp. I just patted any extra ink off. It's very important when doing this technique that you do not get this stamp wet at all. That is yet another reason for using the eraser. You don't want any oils, you don't want anything on that stamp. It must be clean, it must be dry. Now you can see I'm making faces. Now you don't want to make your lines on there exactly like the first one, because you don't want all your flowers to look alike, because there's no two flowers that actually look alike. And that's why I like flowers and stamping flowers, because, well, I'm not going to say that you can make a mess, but let's just say you don't have to be precise. So here we go, a little more ink flicking here. Going to make a few more lines on this and stamp our third flower. We are going to go back and do a bit of correction, but not just yet. The hardest part of this particular technique is not messing with it until you're done, or until you're done with a particular set of stamps. I don't know if you can tell, look closely at the flower in the top right hand corner. You see the edges of the petals are quite dark, with the centers being very muted out. That's what you want. So next we're going to go in and stamp the other one. Again, I'm cleaning that stamp really well with this eraser. You want to make sure you do not use a sand eraser or an eraser that says it will erase ink, because, well, that's a lie. There's no such thing as an ink eraser. But they do contain sand and rougher materials. So my preference is to use a vinyl eraser or a rubber one. You also have to make sure your rubber eraser is not too dried out. But basically, you know, a new pencil probably do the trick for you if you don't have an artist's eraser. You also want to be sure and not get what's called a hard vinyl eraser, which you find in a lot of like the school kits, with the really sharp edges on them, because you can actually cut your stamp with those. So you're looking for a soft eraser that is vinyl or rubber. All right, you can see again, I'm patting the stamp off. I'm not actually doing a full clean on it. And we're just throwing some more ink on there. Very, very haphazard, very light. I keep telling my husband I was flicking the ink, and he's really had a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to repeat that. I will go on and just tell you that this is the last one in this. I've sped this up a bit so you don't have to keep watching it over and over, and then we're going to move to stamping the centers. But this is all we do to stamp the flowers on. Now I did take a moment and stamp a flower on the inside. I used on the inside of, oh, here we go. This is where I'm actually going. You see, I'm just barely touching the ink, touching the pen to the edges. Just want to make sure that the edges of that stamp are show up. You don't want it really dark, because that's the point of watercolors. You have light and dark. Now here I have already put one of my masks on, the sending mask. I've done this because to remind me to do it, and so I know where it's going to go on the page. You have to have this mask if you're going to go for a stamp later on. Okay, now here we're stamping the centers, and I'm using the pumpkin pie ink, and then on the edges where you can see actually quite a demarcation, I'm using pecan pie. Yeah, Stampin' Up! Likes naming things after food, which, you know, used early espresso in the other one, so I'm set to go. Got a little pie in my coffee. Now, what I'm doing here, as you can see, just the brown is only going on that outer rim. Now, in this particular one, I'm going to actually put some more. See, I'm just coloring the top bit in because I want to make that cone flower more cone looking. So I just popped that up on the top so it stood up on the top. And then here's the last of the edge ones. You can see coloring all in with the pumpkin pie and then dotting a little bit of the brown pecan pie on it. And it turns out really clean. I didn't wind up doing any touch-up on the flower centers. I felt like they looked pretty good just from the stamping. But if you do feel like there's not enough ink on there, you can go in with your lighter color and restamp it. Because these are photopolymer and they're clear, it's very easy to see where you're stamping. Now here on the center one, I'm only putting that pumpkin pie on the very edges because when the flower is young or just opened up, the center is very flat and it's very consistent. It's very bright orange. The mature flowers almost have a brown center, but they have orange spikes coming out of them. So that's why there's not very much brown in this, because I was trying to go for the real colors. Okay. Next, what I'm doing is I have already cleaned the stamp, and I'm putting some masks over the flowers that I made. I didn't cut out a mask for every flower. It wasn't really necessary, but I did enough so I could sort of stamp half of the card at once. When you have a die set, making masks is really easy because you take a piece of Post-it note paper and you run it through with the die on it, and it's perfect and it's great. But if you don't have a die, it's just as easy to stamp onto the Post-it note paper. Now be sure and stamp at the top of the paper so you get that good Post-it note glue on the back of it, and then you just cut it out. Now the edges of the stamp, I don't know if at some part you'll see me, I keep sort of touching the sending stamp over there because the S keeps wanting to come up because I rub my hand on it. There's no actual glue under that, the top part of the S. But it doesn't matter, it stays on fine because we're pushing it down, we're stamping over the top of it. Now again, I'm using really light flicking motion with this. I did stamp this off a couple of times. So I could figure out, because the green is very, very dark, I didn't want to overwhelm my other colors. So I had to, you can see, you can't see, I'm doing it off camera, but I'm sort of patting off the extra ink on there. If you look closely, you can see the ink is almost bubbled up. I did not get this as clean as the flower stamps. It still looks really good, but when you get too much ink on these stamps, you will get those little bubbles, which is, a lot of people don't like the photopolymer stamps because they're way easy to over ink. Now see, I stamped off to check on this particular stamp to see how it was taking the ink and what it was going to do. So this one actually can take quite a bit more ink. I don't know if you realize, you can see here when I stamp it down, it's actually a bit darker than the others. But it's okay. That's why you do the test. Have a piece of scrap paper there, and keep going and touching the scrap paper, and you'll be fine. Now you can see here I'm moving my masks around. Now look at the bottom flower on the right. There's an area all the way around it, which you can see better once I move the stamp. You want this sort of white area, and this is something that you will see in a lot of watercolor work as well. Is you don't want those wet colors to blend together, which is another thing. It's another reason this looks sort of like a watercolor, because if you had gone up and touched it, then you would get the ink blending, and I don't know about you, but every time I try to blend colors, they usually come out as brown. So just a step, make sure you use the masks. It'll make a big difference in the end, especially in this technique. I've had a lot of questions about using watercolor paper. Since we're just going to be stamping over and over again, you can give that a watch and then listen to me just carry on. But I find with this technique, watercolor paper works the best. Partially because of the texture of the paper, because watercolor texture is not completely smooth. I think that makes a difference. It gives the stamping look a little bit rougher. But I think it's the way that it absorbs the ink. I have done this many times on regular cardstock. It looks fine. The inside of the card I did, and you'll see that when we get to it in a minute, but the inside of the inside of the card was regular white cardstock. I didn't use my watercolor paper for that, and it looks just fine. But if you had a chance to look at it closely, and I do encourage you to experiment with it because this is just a lot of fun to play with. Watercolor, regular cardstock versus watercolor. You need a lot less ink if you're working on cardstock. I know that sounds crazy, but the cardstock is more likely to absorb that ink, and it'll absorb it and spread out. Whereas this, the light ink tends to just stay where you put it. Now, if you wanted to use what I call the flick technique, where you flick water over it and make little dots, you can do that, especially if you're using the watercolor paper. But I didn't feel the need to with this particular pattern. What I have just done is I've just used my stamp off techniques and put light and dark leaves all through there. You want to do both the light and the dark and the mid-tone because that's what gives you the depth. The look I was going for here was sort of as if you were looking at a field of echinacea or a very dense bed. But that's what we were going for. And as you can see, the more I put on there, the better it is. I want to remind you again not to get frustrated, because even when I was doing this, I thought I could never do this. I'm going to scrap this design. This looks like a hot mess. Nobody's going to want to do this. Because quite frankly, right now it looks terrible. But and yours will too, I promise. Probably not a promise you want to hear, but you have to just keep on. You have to persist. You have to get that stamping in there, not evenly, because the point is to not make it evenly, but you have to keep going. All right, now we're going to stamp the sending, and you'll see it's going to become very clear. See, there's the eraser again. You need to get that stamp good and clean. No oily fingers, no nothing, and that final eraser will take it all right off. I am going to use, I actually don't have a Melon Mambo stamp pad, which is what that beautiful dark pink color is, which I have decided I'm going to have to get one, especially after finishing this project. So instead of using a stamp pad, which you certainly could at this point, I used my marker again. I thought I would just continue on to have that sort of watercolor effect. And I'm actually literally going in and using the side of the brush and coloring each bit of the marker. Now, I'm also going to use something here. I didn't need to do it in using the other bits, but we're going to use the huff technique, where I literally pick the stamp up and go on it. Do you remember what you did when you were a kid and you drew a little heart, you huffed on the window or the mirror and you drew a little heart on it? That's what you're doing. You're fogging it up. Well, no, actually what you're doing is you're putting moisture onto the stamp, which is going to reactivate any dried bits or any ink that's drying, because it does dry quickly. And it's very difficult to do the entire, oh, this is fun. Here's a reveal. Now you have a nice clean space for stamping in. And I don't know if you saw the huff. The stamp was really quite blurry when I put it back down. Should have drawn on it for you. That would have been silly though. And now you see the reason we did it. You can actually see the stamping. Now, just like I did with the flowers, I'm going in and making some dark places. When I first stamped this on my sample, I didn't need to do this. I got enough ink on there. I don't know. I just felt like this needed the color brightened up a little bit. And as you can see, it still looks soft and watercolory. But I've just I'm picking out little tiny bits, just putting little dabs of color in here to brighten it up. Yep, so you need to do a little more right there and a little more right here. Really simple. And if you go outside the lines, it doesn't matter, because it's supposed to be a watercolor. It's supposed to be soft and fuzzy. Now for the next part, I'm using what I'm showing you in that picture very briefly. Is I have gotten some adhesive strips that have they're like dimensionals, but they're strips. And I have stamped the rest of the greeting which is Sunshine to Brighten Your Day, onto a piece of watercolor paper. Again, I don't have the Melon Memo stamp set, so I just colored my stamp in and used the Huff technique and pressed it down onto the white paper, and then I cut it out with the die. You can actually just cut it out. You don't need a fancy die. Just cut it out around there. See, that's the center, which I did on plain cardstock. Looks very similar. I'm going to put a matte down. I wanted to bring in that fresh freesia that we used, because the fresh freesia is such a pretty color, such a background color. So the fresh freesia and the Mambo are the colors of the flowers. I'm going to glue that down here. That always takes a minute. Now, I was trying to come up with a way to finish this, and because I liked it, and I didn't want to put too much finishing on it, so I looked around in my box, and I had some embellishments called tinsel gems. And if you're interested in them, they come in a 3-pack tinsel gem and a 4-pack tinsel gem. Well, this is the 3-pack tinsel gem, and the color of the little thingies, I don't know if they have a word. I guess they're little gems, but it's a pale pink. It is a fresh freesia color, which is another great thing about Stampin' Up. Everything in their line of colors matches. So we have lovely fresh freesia cardstock. We have fresh freesia Stampin' pads. We have fresh freesia markers, which we've used in this video, and then again the fresh freesia embellishments. There's also ribbons. There's everything you can think of. So it makes life so much easier when you're actually using the Stampin' Up products. I want to thank you for watching the video today, and see you soon.